This is BBC Television. And now, here's a special announcement.
It was a great shock to me to hear at lunchtime today that Ian Fleming was dead. He came into my life through Dr. No and From Russia with Love. And strangely enough, when I first met him, he wasn't somebody I particularly liked. But as I got to know him better, I grew to like him immensely.
On August 12th, 1964, Ian Fleming passed away at the age of 56, suffering from a heart attack. He always wanted his Bond books to make it to the silver screen, but he only ever got to see Dr. No and From Russia with Love. He died a month before the release of Goldfinger. Though he visited the set during the filming, he sadly never witnessed the cultural impact and the spy craze that followed from the blockbuster that became, let alone witness how the series would go on for over 60 years, becoming the longest running movie franchise in cinematic history. If only he knew. What caused this heart attack, you may wonder? While it was no secret that Fleming was an excessive smoker and drinker, the stress he was under, facing court cases over the rights of James Bond, also played a huge factor. Going back in time, before any Bond films were made, Fleming's novels had become immensely popular in the late 50s. As I said, Fleming always had the feeling Bond could be brought to the big screen. But apart from Casino Royale being loosely adapted into a live TV episode of some show called Climax, it hadn't happened. Before meeting with Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, who eventually would get Bond movies made, Fleming was first in talks with two different filmmakers, Kevin McClory and Jack Whittingham. The three of them ended up brainstorming for a screenplay of a potential Bond film. You can totally imagine the three casually dreaming up ideas at a late warm evening at Fleming's Jamaica villa over some drinks. The film never got made. With Fleming releasing a new Bond novel every year, he just went on to write his next Bond book, Thunderball, using ideas and plot elements of the screenplay that never became a film. This caused McClory to sue Fleming. Fleming lost the court case. Though Thunderball was still allowed to be published with credits to McClory and Whittingham, but they also won the rights to several elements of the story, including that of the fictional organization Spectre. I always wondered what exactly McClory came up with and what did Fleming came up with during their brainstorming. My guess is that even they didn't really remember, as they just dreamed up ideas collectively, which makes this court case so sour for Fleming. But I definitely guess that the name Spectre came from Fleming himself. I mean, the man just loves that word. He named a town Spectreville in his Diamonds Are Forever novel and had a Spectre decoding machine in From Russia with Love. There's no way Fleming didn't come up with the name. Anyway, fast forward back to the actual filmmakers that did bring Bond to the big screen successfully in the 60s, having made Dr. No, From Russia with Love and Goldfinger. But fearing that McClory would come out of the works and produce a rival Bond film, Cubby and Harry were left with no choice but to make a deal with him. He needed to be brought in if they ever wanted to produce Thunderball on their own. This is why Kevin McClory is credited as the producer on this film as a part of the deal, while Cubby and Harry were the executive producers on this one. McClory also got to make a little cameo in the film too. Anyway, the rest is history, and as of 2025 it has been 60 years since this film released, and the time has come to take another detailed look at it. Following the enormous success of Goldfinger, the world now undergoing Bond mania in the mid-60s, and now having an audience with huge expectations, there really was only one way to market Thunderball. The biggest Bond of all. Well, at least in terms of budget, they put their money where their mouth was. Thunderball certainly was the biggest yet in that regard. Dr. No had a $1 million budget, From Russia with Love was made with $2 million, and Goldfinger with $3 million. Now the producers got to play with $9 million. Guy Hamilton was asked back, but felt too creatively drained after directing Goldfinger. So Terence Young, director of the first two films, was brought back. Ken Adam returned for the production design, and of course, Sean Connery would slip back into the tux to once again star as 007. The creative team had the daunting task of living up to what I consider a masterpiece. It's worth noting that not only did they succeed with that, but when adjusted for inflation, Thunderball was the most financially successful Bond film for decades, all the way up to 2012 as a matter of fact. You would think in that regard that Thunderball was another masterpiece. Is it worthy of its self-proclaimed biggest Bond of all label? With its $9 million budget came a wider and more cinematic aspect ratio. This meant that the gun barrel had to be reshot, and that this was the first time Connery himself was seen in the gun barrel, compared to the stuntman Bob Simmons, who was in the gun barrel in the first three films. We open up on a coffin with the initials of James Bond on there. Of course, it's not his funeral, but that of a certain Jacques Beauvoir, who murdered two of Bond's colleagues.
Jacques Beauvoir murdered two of my colleagues.
Only during this opening, he's aided by this female agent of the French Secret Service. From what I gather, the actress, Maurice Guy Mitsuku, was also a stripper working in nightclubs in Paris, which makes you wonder how the producers came about her. But in spite of her very minor appearance, curiously, they did take the effort to take some promotional stills of her character. I mean, you can't show up in a Bond film for 1 minute in the 60s without a bikini picture being taken. You know, promotion. But anyway, Bond notices something fishy as Jacques Beauvoir's widow leaves the funeral. You're not shitting me. So Bond rushes over to the widow's house to confirm his suspicions.
I've come to offer my sincere condolences. My dear Colonel Beauvoir, I don't think you should have opened that car door by yourself.
Ah, yes, of course, because it's absolutely inconceivable that a woman in the 60s would open a car door without any help of a gentleman. It turns out it's Jacques Beauvoir himself, which, by the way, is played by the same Bob Simmons that did the gun barrel in the 3 previous films. I think Simmons and Connery got along well off camera. And the fight is not bad. It's quite unique to see Connery fight his own stunt double. He ends up brutally killing him with that poker off the fireplace. Pretty rough. Before Beauvoir's goons show up, Bond makes his escape with a jetpack, which apparently he has. It's one of those things they could only really get away with in the early Bond films. It's apparently a real operating jetpack that was used by the US Army at the time. But I think because of that hokey blue screen effect it's shown with for most of the shots, you would assume that this was just creative filmmaking. But no, it's actually a guy touching down with that thing for real. It must have been pretty cool to see that in the 60s, but looking at this today, you just end up kind of laughing at it, because admittedly, it does date the film. You should never really question logic in the Bond films, especially not in the early films, and during pre-title sequences. But when you do start doing that anyway, as soon as Beauvoir left the funeral, Bond must have flown over to his place with that jetpack, without being seen or heard. Nobody heard the jet exhaust. Quickly rushed into the place and then quickly sat down on the chair to confront Beauvoir. It's a Bond film, and much like Goldfinger's opening, Terence Young must have just continued Guy Hamilton's philosophy of the pre-titles.
It seemed to me that
if we could do the pre-credit sequence, which is a wonderful piece of nonsense.
And you could also think deeper of how Bond suddenly got his DB5 back after crashing it into Goldfinger's factory in the previous film. But let's not. Let's just agree with Guy Hamilton on this, that this was another wonderful piece of nonsense. This is what opened the film. Strap yourselves in as we start off Thunderball. Maurice Binder returned to design the opening titles, as From Russia With Love and Goldfinger's titles were both uniquely designed by Robert Brownjohn. But here, Maurice Binder first introduced that iconic signature look that the opening titles would have for the next 3 decades following. With silhouetted naked women, in this case erotically swimming, and it's just typical Bond. It's great. The song played over the titles was done by Tom Jones.
He strikes like thunderbolt.
Tom Jones wasn't actually the first choice. Shirley Bassey would have returned and already recorded the song Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang for the film.
The kiss, kiss, bang, bang.
Bond films often use instrumental variations of the title song within the soundtrack of the rest of the film. And Thunderball still mostly features the instrumental version of her song throughout. But because the studios requested that the title song should have the title of the film in there, Tom Jones produced a song for it instead. I always loved how the opening titles end, fading into the Eiffel Tower, with the colors of the French flag surrounding it. It's very subtle, pretty neat. We get introduced to Emilio Largo, our main villain, played by Italian actor Adolphe Celli. Much like in the previous film, the main villain is dubbed, this time by Robert Riady. In the Bond novels, Bond was mostly dealing with Smurfs as the main villains, as it would take 9 novels until Spectre would be introduced for a trilogy, starting with Thunderball. With the cinematic Bond, of course, Spectre was already introduced in the first film, and in From Russia With Love. But they are faithful here, introducing their main HQ being hidden behind some office building in Paris. The Spectre boardroom itself is much more inventive in the film version. Ken Adam really got to flex his creative muscle now with this bigger budget, with this amazing film set. It's very memorable and classic Bond. Villains discussing how they each brought in millions throughout various global criminal affairs, with Spectre No. 1 still remaining faceless, sinisterly stroking his white cat and pressing buttons to electrocute those that failed to bring in enough money. Classic 60s, larger-than-life Bond villains. I love it. I was always curious about the voice of Blofeld in this film, because he sounds like Joseph Weisman, who played Dr. No.
2,000,003. Our expectations were considerably higher, number 11.
I mean, tell me that doesn't sound like him. I would have just preferred it if they just stuck with Eric Pohlman's voice that they used for him in From Russia With Love.
Come in, Kronstein. Sit down, number 3, while we listen to what number 5 has devised for us.
Apparently, though, they did. This was Eric Pohlman's voice. Well, at least according to this trivia page on IMDb. I still have my doubts, though. To me, the voice sounds worlds apart from his performance in From Russia With Love. I tried to look into it more, but all sources point to Eric Pohlman. Weird. Anyway, the plot. Thunderball's story premise is very simple. Spectre is going to steal 2 nuclear weapons, threaten to launch them on a major city unless they pay a ransom of $100 million. Honestly though, this of course is the idea that Fleming and McClory came up with together and is playing off a very contemporary fear of the Cold War. Now that nuclear weapons were first developed, them falling into the wrong hands was certainly a threat the world would worry about. It's the perfect premise for a Bond story. In the novel, Bond is sent off to a health spa because of his unhealthy lifestyle. In the film, it's not really explained why he went to shrublands, but he's just taking some time off. I visited this location in real life in 2022, by the way.
I don't think it's because it's a sort of certain part of the film. I don't think it's as iconic to be usually YouTube ones like the jetpack.
There's no NATO base next to it though, like in the movie. Yeah, in the film, a relaxing health spa is placed next to a military NATO base.
Damned airplanes.
It's pretty stupid. Speaking of plot-convenient ideas, Bond just happens to run into a Spectre agent, Count Lippy here. He is of course also spending time with a beautiful nurse, Patricia Faring, played by Molly Peters, who he just molests. She somehow doesn't seem to mind that much though. I mean, she willingly jumps into bed with him a few scenes later and insists he should call her when they depart in the end. So again, there's more than enough proof of consent. There's always the risk of looking at these older Bond films through modern eyes instead of through a lens of the 1960s. You can definitely make it awkward in places to watch this. For me, this moment is more awkward than that barn scene in Goldfinger. That one at least saved a lot of lives and prevented Operation Grand Slam. As I said in my Goldfinger episode, there it felt more like a 1960s way of courting woman, a love dance if you will. Again, with consent, she's kind of slowly giving in to Bond, which is hardly perceived as something romantic nowadays, but some of our grandparents might disagree on this. But here, I think even our grandparents would struggle to call this romantic or anything like that. He's Sean Connery though, we know the attraction is mutual, and I definitely advise to just go along with it through the lens of the times this was made in. Bond is put on this weird spine-stretching device, which Count Lippy switches into the Formula 1 setting. Don't ask me why a machine designed to release tension would have such a high-speed setting on there. It just does. This is another example of something that works on the page but fails to translate convincingly to the big screen. Like that tank in Dr. No. It was a much more tense moment in the book. Here it just totally looks like Connery is dry humping. It leans much more towards being hilarious instead of dramatic. Miss Faring turns the machine off and is afraid that this will cost her her job, which puts Bond into blackmail mode. Yup, that's Bond, folks. Again, the lens of the 60s. Bond gets back Count Lippy by switching his steam machine into the boiling hot volcano setting, before jumping back into the sack with his favorite nurse. Shortly after, we are introduced to Fiona Volpe, played by Luciana Paluzzi. I would claim she was the first true femme fatale of the series. You could say that Miss Tarot was the first in Dr. No, who was undercover at the government house, probably blackmailed into working for Dr. No, but really didn't pose much danger other than listening through keyholes. You could argue for Rosa Clapp being a femme fatale, but you know, this one is young and hot. Luciana Paluzzi originally auditioned for Domino, the main Bond girl, that is to be introduced later. But I'm happy she got this role instead, and in retrospect, Paluzzi preferred this role too. The part was made up for the movie, by the way, because the character wasn't in the novel. In a way, Fiona Volpe is the archetype of the female henchman in Bond films, which I truly feel would not be topped until decades later. She's sleeping with a NATO pilot, Francois Derval, who gets killed by an impersonator who had plastic surgery to look just like him. This is all part of Spectre's plan to steal the nuclear bombs, which, again, are right next door of the health spa. So, fake Derval makes his way into the NATO base, boarding the Vulcan bomber, which is carrying the nukes. I am not sure why a plane would be carrying weapons of mass destruction on a routine training flight, but hey, I'm not in the military, what do I know? Fake Derval kills everyone through some gas. It's probably Delta 9 gas.
Delta 9? What's that? An invisible nerve gas.
He changes course and brings the bombs to Spectre, with Largo waiting on his yacht in the Disco Volante. Spectre made this extravagant underwater runway, which I always thought was pretty cool. What I don't like though is this shot of the plane sinking to the bottom of the ocean. Compare this to the Jerry Anderson show, Thunderbirds, which was made in the same year. Look at the model work and attention to detail that Derek Maddings brought to that show. This looks like a plane that had weight, when it sunk to the ocean. The ocean being filled with underwater vegetation, little fish, and this was just a TV show. Thunderball is a $9 million cinema film, and it just looks like a little plane is being dropped into a tank of water with some sand on the bottom, which technically is exactly what we're looking at, but there's no excuse. This just looks cheap. Thankfully, that same Derek Meddings would start working on the Bond films later down the line. Another issue Thunderball has is in its storytelling. People often complain that the movie drags in a lot of places and that the problem is in its pacing, but for me, it's more the way the story is laid out. Obviously, this hijacking was in the book, and on the one hand, it is great to see exactly how Spectre performs the act. The divers coming in, hiding the plane, taking the nukes aboard of the Disco Volante and such, but it leaves very little mystery to the story. We know the plane is kept underwater. We know who the villain is. We know the bombs are brought aboard of the yacht. We know the fake Derval is killed. We essentially already know everything Bond is yet to find out. This is a problem I critiqued in my book review of Thunderball 2, and if anything, the screenplay is being faithful to the book, but as it stands now, we know exactly what Spectre has done, and we will spend the next hour and a half waiting for Bond to unravel all this. Maybe it would have been more interesting if we just saw that Spectre had a plan to steal the nuclear weapons, but then we're not shown how they do it. Then Bond would just find that dead body at the health spa, but we would have no idea who it is and how and why this was done and how it all relates to Spectre's plan. Maybe not even show that Largo is working for Spectre and was put in charge of this operation. That way, we could have unraveled much more of the mystery alongside Bond, like they did in Dr. No. Imagine if in that film, Strangways gets killed, and we would have to watch the three blind mice take those stolen documents up to Crab Key, and we would immediately be shown that Dr. No was behind all this. And then we would see Dr. No give instructions to the driver and the photographer girl to await Bond's arrival at the airport. Then people would also say that the scenes of him trying to figure everything out would drag or are very tedious to watch, or that the film had pacing issues or whatever. But because that entire plot wasn't spoon-fed to us beforehand, the unraveling in that film remained interesting. You see my point? So Bond leaves the health spa and makes his way over to MI6. Count Lippy follows him and tries to kill Bond, but before he can make a move, he gets killed by Fiona Volpe for not predicting that the fake Derval would demand more money. It's really extravagant. Not only was Count Lippy against that money race in the first place, but how was he supposed to know? I guess it shows more of Spectre's ruthlessness, and it's a nice introduction to Fiona Volpe's killer's side. I always wondered why she didn't bother to kill Bond here though. If you look at the continuity of the film so far, they should already be aware that Bond is an enemy of Spectre, now having thwarted their plans in 2 previous films. You could say, well, this is a faithful adaptation of Thunderball, and in the book, Bond only gets to deal with them for the first time in this story. So maybe they don't know who he is yet. But even later in the movie itself, they state this.
Because he is Bond, and as an enemy of Spectre, should be killed.
They say it. He should be killed. He's an enemy of Spectre. So why not kill him now? They know who he is. Why let him go? So Bond gets to MI6, perfectly safe, and is briefed in the conference room, another grand film set brought to life by Can Adam. I like how they gave this film a lot of scope, with all the double O's being brought in. One of them is female, by the way, but that's only seen on this behind-the-scenes photo. The giant painting revealing the world map is cool too, though the electrical sound effect that was used was always a bit goofy to me, as it's so obvious that the painting is just a carpet that is being lifted. But yeah, it has its charms. I do like how M immediately believes Bond when he requests his location to look for the nukes to be changed from Canada to Nassau, because the Vulcan bomber pilot Derval has a sister living there. And he tells M he saw the dead body of Derval at Shrublands.
You were seen boarding the Vulcan, took off last night. If 007 says he saw Derval last night at Shrublands and he was dead, that's enough for me to initiate inquiries.
It tells us a lot about the relationship between M and Bond, and he doesn't question Bond's professionalism. If 007 saw that he was dead, then that's the end of it. So now it's up to Bond to figure out how to get into contact with the sister of Derval. In Dr. No and From Russia with Love, Terence Young had shots of the airplane touching down at the destination of the mission, and Bond arriving at the airports. Thankfully, he skips all over that this time. Bond closes the door and we just skip to the Bahamas straight away. However, though it would not do the movie's pacing any good, I would have liked it to see a bit more of how Bond tracked down Derval's sister, because immediately he just found her, randomly. In the book, Fleming had quite an interesting scene of Bond meeting her at some tobacco shop. I'm not saying we needed that scene in the film, but this is our main Bond girl, and I wouldn't mind to have seen how Bond found her. Anyway, during his mission, Bond would be assisted by another MI6 agent, Paula, played by Martine Beswick, who had previously starred as one of the two gypsy girls in From Russia with Love. I had the honor of meeting her in real life. Quite a sweet woman. Watching Thunderball always feels like you're on vacation. The Bahamas made for a great location, and I'm sure the cast and crew had an absolute blast filming there. And as much as I critiqued the film for taking away most of its mystery, they at least attempt to incorporate a bit of that with the two separate men shadowing Bond and the Bond girl here. It's time to talk about her, Domino Derval, played by Claudine Auger. I'm not sure I ever mentioned it in any of my videos, but she's really hot. And you can tell Bond thinks the same. Yes, I must be 6 inches taller. I wouldn't call her necessarily just an eye candy Bond girl though. We find out she's a kept woman of our main villain Largo, and Purple Shirt Guy is just one of his goons keeping an eye out on her for her guardian. So we know Bond can't just get to her easily now that we learned that she's an innocent in the villain's camp. What I do really enjoy about the writing of Thunderball is the dialogue, and in particular, the jokes. Most definitely, this can be attributed to Terence Young and Connery again, who were said to have a similar sense of humor, and it really shows.
So, what sharp little eyes you've got.
Wait till you get to my teeth.
I mean, admit it, every man wants to be this witty if the opportunity is there. And every man just smiles at this moment. This is why we love Bond. So now that Bond has touched base with Domino, he goes to the casino in the evening to get into contact with her guardian, Largo. It's the first casino scene since Dr. No. I like the signature poking the bee's nest that Bond is doing.
Yes, I thought I saw a spectre at your shoulder.
What do you mean?
Ah, it's your spectre against mine, huh?
This is actually taken from the novel, and I like how this was done. Bond is of course just going by a hunch. It's funny to think what would have happened to someone that didn't turn out to be working for Spectre at all. He would be like, what the hell is this guy on about? Spectre on the shoulder? Who says that? What a douche! In the book, both are suspicious of one another, but aren't exactly sure of each other's identities yet. Like I said before, in the book, Bond had not dealt with Spectre yet, and vice versa. Here in the movie, they did a good job in keeping it faithful to the book, yet putting in a hint that Largo already knows who he is through Count Lippy.
Oh yes, Mr. Bond. One of my associates spoke about you.
Bond defeats Largo and asks if he can take Domino for a drink. Only Bond would ask someone else's woman out for a drink and then just order caviar with her and take her for a dance when the dude is at the same place. It's clear from multiple behind-the-scenes pictures that Connery and Claudine Auger got along well. Might even have been too close with rumors of them having an affair, but hey, he was Sean Connery in the 1960s and she was a former Miss France. Can't blame the guy. If anything, their chemistry shines through in this scene. I could totally believe that a woman like her would fall for a man like him.
You are not like Largo. The way you hold me.
Bond learns that she has no idea that her brother was killed, and of course Largo tries to find out whatever Bond wanted to know upon leaving the place. So I guess that chef worked his butt off to prepare that caviar for the squad. Terence Young always liked to include the typical scene of Bond arriving back at his hotel lobby, while the receptionist is swooning over him. This time, the Bond theme isn't playing like in the previous two occasions, but it seems like a very signature thing of his Bond films. Another observation I made, that I never really heard anyone talk about, is the fact that Bond is back wearing the same outfit he wore in the afternoon at the swimming pool with Domino. He just got back from the casino, where he was wearing a tuxedo and it was nighttime. Yet he's back to wearing his afternoon outfit, it's clearly daytime again, and he runs into Largo's goon in his hotel, also wearing the outfit he was wearing that afternoon, and runs into Felix, who's also wearing the outfit he was wearing that afternoon, and not the tuxedo we last saw him in at the casino in the background. My best guess is they originally intended this scene to take place right after the meeting with Domino at the pool. But upon editing the film, they probably figured that it would make more sense for the plot to have this scene take place after the meeting with Largo in the casino instead, and just hope that nobody would notice it switched back to daytime and there was no more tuxedo. It's nothing major, of course, and heck, only fans like me endlessly discussing every minute detail in these films would point it out 60 years later. But yeah, it's an observation worth sharing. Felix is this time played by Rick van Nutter, a guy who clearly has a Dutch name, but I think it's only in his ancestry. He leans more towards the Jack Lord sort of Felix, instead of the more old-timer looking Zack Linder of the previous film. Isn't it weird that Bond punches Felix for almost saying 007, but then a minute later he says this in front of the goon anyway?
Sorry about that, Felix, but you're just about to say 007. Yeah.
I never got that either. The guy doesn't seem to be fully unconscious as he's quickly put up, and he could have just overheard the 007 thing. What was the point? And then also this moment where Connery's dialogue does not match his lips at all.
I've got a yacht we should take a look at later.
It's all a bit clunky in these scenes. So the guy reports back to Largo and is soon fed to the sharks since Bond got the better of him. This is classic Bond villain stuff. It sets up Largo nicely and is just over the top enough to put a smile on your face. That shot of his point of view with the water turning red from the blood is also nicely done. Bond, Felix, Paula, and some other redundant extra contact by the name of Pinder go out to meet Q in the field.
I must say, I find this business of equipping you in the field highly irregular.
This was indeed the first in the series, and yeah, that was still irregular. From here on in though, Q would show up in the field often. Don't ask me why he is sent out to Bond and not to any of the other 800 agents who were all sent out to different locations within that large circle for Operation Thunderball. But I guess Bond needed him most. I guess it's true though, Bond is the only one sent out to the correct location. He receives a Geiger counter watch, an underwater camera, along with a homing signal pill and a cool portable breathing apparatus. It's a pretty fun Q scene. Although Bond is being very deliberately annoying towards Q, which in retrospect, knowing their dynamic in future Bond films, is kind of curious to see. From here on in, the film slows down significantly, and that problem I talked about earlier of us as the audience being ahead of Bond becomes a bit apparent again. He's still just tagging along, trying to find out everything we already know. Whether or not Largo has anything to do with the nukes being stolen, MI6 wondering where the bombs are. Again, there is a real lack of mystery. That could have easily been here if we just knew as little as Bond. A lot of scenes for Thunderball supposedly ended up on the cutting room floor, because so much footage was shot for it, and the original cut would have been way too long from what I read. Yet it is remarkable how it still feels way too long in this middle portion of the film, because we're just so ahead. It gets more interesting with Bond diving under the Disco Volante to take pictures and the grenades being thrown at him. But it's really not until Fiona Volpe comes back into the mix where the screen is lit up again. She was probably flown into the Bahamas by Spectre to take care of Bond. The scene of the two in the car is a lot of fun and their dialogue is just great.
Fly here often?
Some men just don't like to be driven.
No, some men just don't like to be taken for a ride.
In the next few scenes, Bond and his allies develop the pictures to find out that the Disco Volante has an underwater hatch, and that the nuke hijacking must have been an underwater operation, and thus the plane must be hidden underwater somewhere. Now, I know I stressed this enough during this review, but just imagine how much more of a revelation this moment would have been had we discovered all of these things alongside Bond. Then we would be like, so that's how they did it. They must have crash-landed the plane in the water and then hijacked the bombs that way. But because we already found all of this out around an hour ago, all these finding out scenes just feel like necessary filler for the story to still make sense. But for us as the audience, they just feel empty. The scene of Bond visiting Largo at his Palmyra villa is fun though. It's obvious by this point that both Bond and Largo know exactly who they're up against, yet they're still keeping up the charade in their politeness. These are the scenes that do keep the movie interesting. Again, great moments of dialogue.
That gun looks more fitting for a woman.
Do you know much about guns, Mr. Bond?
No, I know a little about women.
Paul!
Seems terribly difficult. No, it isn't, is it?
Largo's henchman Mr. Vargas is one of these more bland henchmen in the series, but he kind of reminds me of Sosa's henchman Alberto from Scarface. They both have that similar standing in the background, yet you need to keep an eye on them sort of quality. Meanwhile, Fiona enters Bond's hotel room, and Paula, who really seems to be doing her absolute best looking for these nukes, gets kidnapped. Fiona discovers Bond's pictures and the tables turn. I don't know why Bond bothered to take the pictures to his hotel room when he could have easily kept them hidden at the hideout that these pictures were developed at. I mean, he knows Fiona stays at the same hotel. He clearly knows enemies can usually get into his hotel rooms with relative ease, even during this movie. And he knows their hideout is completely undiscovered by his enemies. Yet he took the pictures to the hotel. Yeah, plot convenience. Bond is spending time with Domino at the Junkanoo parade until he's rushed in by Felix, letting him know that Paula is gone. Bond raids the Palmyra at night to find Paula was tortured and took her cyanide capsule before he could get to her. It's honestly a shame. Her character ended up being the sacrificial lamb that served little other purpose in the story. It would have been more interesting to see her character developed a bit more. It doesn't really seem to faze Bond or the story in any way. Even later on, his allies seem completely unbothered by her death.
Tell him Paula's dead. Okay.
It's like he just told Pinder to tell Felix to pick up the groceries. Okay. I mean, what kind of reaction is that? Also, doesn't it seem like there should be a sound effect for the door here when Bond comes out of the basement? It's quite convenient that that didn't make a sound. Bond falls into the pool, and thankfully he has the breathing apparatus in his infantry.
He always used these things, and he always used them at the right time. It was brilliant, the timing of them. He fell into a pool with sharks going about, and he had breathing apparatus. He never went, crap, I haven't got the breathing apparatus.
So he escapes the pool and gets back to his hotel, only to find that Fiona has now taken her place there, starting one of my favorite Bond moments.
Since you're here, would you mind giving me something to put on?
It just leaves you with a big smile. That smooth son of a bitch. This is why we love Bond. Of course, he is perfectly aware that she is working for Spectre, spotting her ring again. Aware that she is indirectly responsible for Paula's suicide. So he does what every sensible man ought to do. Bang her brains out. But unlike Pussy Galore, who he could easily convert to the side of good after sleeping with her, Fiona became the first woman he couldn't just simply win over. This one is different. It kept both her character and the story interesting.
James Bond, who only has to make love to a woman and she starts to hear heavenly choir singing. But not this one. What a blow it must have been. You having a failure.
Well, you can't win them all.
Bond makes a clever escape from Fiona and the Spectre goons at the Junkanoo parade. We Bond fans always like to point out the continuity error of Bond being shot in his leg and having the wound switch from his right to his left leg constantly, and of course the random dog having a piss in the middle of the street with not a care in the world. I always liked all of the scenes at the Kiss Kiss Club. Bond treats his wound, but finds Spectre goons have tracked him down and surrounded him at every corner. He attempts to take a random girl to a dance before Fiona cuts back in.
May I cut in? You should have told me your wife was here.
They do a good job in ramping up the tension with the revolver being drawn sneakily from the back, Bond desperately trying to get an overview of where the danger is coming from, until at the last second he turns Fiona into his shield.
Mind if my friend sits this one out? She's just dead.
It is one of the best moments in the movie, and it's a fitting end to the best villain of the film. From here on in though, the film mostly just drags slowly towards its climax. There's more helicopter searching for the hijacked Vulcan, and Felix and Bond are back into the same clothes as they were in the previous helicopter search before. It makes you wonder, like before, if they decided to change the order of scenes again in post-production. Maybe they were originally intended to find the plane before visiting Largo at his villa. Or maybe they just filmed the two helicopter scenes in one go and they didn't bother to switch their outfits. In any case, Bond finally finds the plane at the bottom of the ocean, and also discovers the fake Derval's body with the original name tag. Now he has proof for Domino. This is his ticket to finding the nukes. But not before first having underwater scuba diving sex with her, as you do. Still yet to try that for myself. I always liked the black and white bikini Claudine Auger is wearing in this scene. On my original recapping episode on this film, I received a comment of someone making an interesting observation about her bikinis. This person noted that in the beginning of the film, her bikinis are black. Towards the middle, it's black and white, and near the end of the film, she's fully in a white bikini, or at least a white dress. He made an argument that this could signal her transfer from the side of Spectre to the side of good. This reminded me of the Star Wars films, where it was definitely intentional that Anakin was wearing lighter clothes in the early films and gradually started to wear darker and darker clothes as he was moving towards the dark side. Here, I'm pretty sure that none of this was ever intentional, as Domino is also seen in a white dress in the beginning of the film, but I thought his observation was worth a mention. Bond telling her about her brother's death was a significant moment in the novel. In the film, they do a decent job in getting this across. A twitch in Bond's hand, hiding his emotions behind his sunglasses, and the tears of Domino. But it's not as prominent and emotional as it was in the novel. To me, Domino wins out on Honey Rider being a slightly deeper character. And, it also helps that they're similar because they're both voiced by Nikki van der Zyl. Though Ursula Andress has the benefit of being the first Bond girl, making her way more iconic. But both Tatiana Romanova and in particular Pussy Galore were the more interesting Bond girls so far in this series, at least character-wise. She smashes them out of the park physically though. I love the moment of Vargas sneaking up on Domino and Bond casually making one of the most badass kills in the entire series.
I think you got the point.
So equipped with Bond's Geiger counter, Domino has to look for the nukes aboard of the Disco Volante. Did you ever notice that in Thunderball the gadget swap functions? The watch was introduced as the Geiger counter, and the camera as, well, the underwater camera. But then they are used in the opposite way. The underwater camera that made the pictures of the hatch was the watch, and now the Geiger counter is the camera. It's yet another odd continuity mistake in the film. Meanwhile, thanks to a hunch that Domino gave him, Bond is looking for the nukes in the outskirts of the Bahamas, and Connery somehow pulls it off to make pink swimming trunks look badass. Posing as one of the Spectre frogmen, Bond tags along with Largo and his crew and discovers a cave in which the nukes were currently hidden, ready to be taken aboard of the Disco Volante. Unfortunately, Bond is discovered by Largo and is left in the cave. With the nukes being back aboard of the Disco, Domino is searching for them, but is soon caught by Largo. I never really talked about what I think of Largo as a villain too much in this review yet, because there honestly is very little to talk about. This moment is probably the most menacing he gets in this film. Adolphe Celli really did not get to show much personality in this film. In the book, his cover was that he was a wealthy man searching for a treasure with his crew. But here, even his cover story is not really made that clear either. We just know that he's number 2 of Spectre and that he's responsible for the stealing of the nukes, but to the outside world, who is he supposed to be? What is his cover? Is he just some wealthy man that just happens to have a pool filled with sharks? I do like the moment where he threw one of his goons into that pool, but character-wise, he's quite bland. The literary Largo was described to have a Roman appearance with the typical hooked nose, and in that regard, Adolphe Celli was perfectly casted physically. Here, we at least get to see more of his scary side as he uses his cigar and ice cubes to torture Domino through heat and cold. I imagine, as an actor, this was probably his favorite scene to play as he finally got to be truly villainous, even though most of his actual torture is just left to our imagination. Thanks to the homing pill, Felix manages to locate Bond through this device. It just shows left and right. Not sure how you would pinpoint Bond that way. I mean, the Homer in Goldfinger with an actual map, that was cool. This makes no sense. Well, maybe to people in the 60s it does. Anyway, Bond is brought back into the mix, and the US Navy is brought in to stop Spectre. Cue the epic end battle of the Navy and Spectre, conveniently clothed in orange and black, in an all-out underwater brawl, which on the one hand was very ambitious. There is so much stuff going on. Films taking place underwater were relatively new in cinema, and they definitely made full use of this technology for Thunderball, as you know. And for today's standards, you may claim that on the other hand, this part of the climax kind of drags. It's a lot of chaos. But I honestly think it's pretty impressive. Must be insane to choreograph this kind of stuff in a convincing way. Also, the fact that Bond joins in on the brawl tells us a lot about his character again. Essentially, he located the nukes. His mission is complete. He is the only one out of all those 00 agents that did succeed. MI6 will be pleased with this. If I was in Bond's shoes, I would grab the Bond girl for some goodbye sex, pack the bags, call it a day, and let the Navy take care of it from here. Not Bond though. To him, it's not over until it's over, and he just joins in on the underwater brawl, risking his life once more. That underwater jetpack thing is very badass. The fact it fires torpedoes is cool too. This is the pre-climax, so to speak, and it easily wins out on the actual climax when Bond climbs aboard of the Disco Volante. Domino is saved by this guy. It's quite remarkable. I nearly spent an hour going in depth over this film, yet I never really talked about this background guy, who now suddenly becomes a guy that feels sorry for Domino and saves her. I'm not sure why he switches sides. He's just probably chickening out over the fact that the Navy is firing frickin' cannons at them, or he's just trying to get laid. But even later on, Domino has no clue who he really was.
Who's he?
I don't know, but he helped me.
She has no clue who it is. We have no clue who it is. I don't think the filmmakers have a clue who he is. I don't think he was in the book. Maybe he was, but I don't think so. So, what was the point of this character and why was he the one to save Domino? Maybe it's because they couldn't figure out a way for Domino to be saved because Bond was too busy fighting Largo upstairs or something, but I don't know. For a $9 million budget, this climax is insultingly bad. The sped up green screen is just terrible and completely takes you out of the movie. This is the biggest Bond of all, folks. Not only does it go over stupidly exaggerated speed, the speed of a fighter jet, but it also just flies over rock formations. Yet in the wide shots, they're just over open sea. I never managed to look at this final fight between Bond and Largo and take it seriously. Compare it to the fight with Red Grant in From Russia with Love, in a movie that has less than a quarter of the budget this one has. There is no contest. That fight still holds up as one of the best in the entire series. This one is just laughable and without any tension. It's Domino that ends it all, much like in the novel, and fires an harpoon in Largo's back. It's a decent moment, though a little bit more emotion would have been welcome. He's responsible for your brother's death. He tortured you. You were a prisoner for years, and now it's all over, but Domino shows very little of all that emotion. It's also the fact that they all just talk so casually while the boat is reaching the speed of sound.
I'm glad I killed him.
You're glad? Who's he?
I don't know, but he helped me.
None of the actors are acting as if they're noticing any of the high velocity or danger that they're in. Shouldn't they be holding on to stuff? If I could come aboard to talk to these three, I would say something along the lines of this.
What the fuck is going on out here? The jet skis just went overboard! Turn around, let's go the other fucking way! We can't! No!
I mean, nothing. No reaction. They just throw the guy that saved Domino overboard, even though he can't swim, poor bastard, and Bond gets the girl. Once again, in true Connery tradition, he is at sea. The plane taking them on the rope is pretty Bondian and leaves you with a smile coming after that bizarre climax. I think I would have preferred it if he was just making out with Domino in the dinghy and Felix tried to radio him like, "Come in, 007," and he could do his cheesy, "Oh, I'm coming in," or whatever other innuendo they could have come up with. Forget it, that's probably just me. So that was another look at Thunderball. We're 60 years on, and as I stated before, it was a box office hit at the time. I think the success of Goldfinger that sparked Bond mania helped its popularity tremendously too. Subtitled The Biggest Bond of All, does it live up to that self-proclaimed tagline? Comparing it to just the 3 films that preceded it, you can certainly tell it does have the bigger budget. Bigger than all 3 films combined, actually. Yet, Thunderball also feels cheap and sometimes clunky in its presentation and editing. Its most glaring problem being its storytelling. Like I said, it would have been better had they not shown Spectre's execution of the entire plan beforehand and left most of it in the dark. The majority of the plot suffers from Bond being behind on the audience, which makes scenes that should be interesting either slow or simply boring because we already know all the things Bond is yet to find out. That isn't to say that interesting stuff doesn't happen in between the unraveling. The Bahamas make for a colorful exotic location, the dialogue is spot on and downright funny in a lot of places, and Fiona Volpe steals the show as one of the most interesting characters. I've also been on record in stating that Thunderball has one of the most attractive lineups of female leads, from Molly Peters to Luciana Paluzzi, from Martine Baswick to Claudine Auger. They're all gorgeous actresses, but a lot of the characters in Thunderball end up being quite bland. Fiona Volpe stands out, but on the other hand, the bar is quite low in the villain department. Adolphe Celli tried to work with what he got, did a decent job, but is the blandest main villain up until this point in the series, meaning compared to the 3 that came before him, and none of his other henchmen have any color or are memorable in any way. Thunderball ended up going down in my personal ranking throughout the years and ended up neatly in the middle portion. I honestly rank all 3 Connery Bond films that came before it higher, because this was the first one I could list quite a few problems with. It is classic Bond though, and being ranked in the middle in a franchise filled with so many different films is not bad at all. Thunderball is far from perfect, but as a Bond fan, I am very proud to be celebrating 60 years of what they called the biggest Bond of all.